Well, welcome to Journey. My name is Jamie. I'm one of the pastors here. It's great to have you with us, and welcome those who are streaming, those who are in overflow. It just struck me, just standing off to the side and watching the band and watching you. We're all storytellers. We're in this series called The Storyteller, and it's, of course, about Jesus, but we're all storytellers. What you chose to wear this morning says something about your story. You're telling a story with your clothing. You're telling a story with your makeup or not wearing makeup. You're telling a story with your posture. When these guys lead, which I'm always blown away every week at how freakishly talented they are, but when they lead, they're telling a story with their music. They're telling a story in their posture. They're telling the story in just the way they play. We're all interpreting art. Art is just simply sharing something through your lens, your craft, offering it back in your own original way, rather than replicating something else. You're being you. That's why coaches of any kind that are trying to help you in any kind of artistic endeavor are saying, look, the most important thing you can do is be you. Don't try to be somebody else. Be you, because there's nobody else like you. The gift to the planet is just to walk in your originality, in that thing that comes out in you. Now, at one level, we are all the same. We are all just an expression of the divine. But for our brief earth walk, we have this chance in the nuances of our body and our spirit to just kind of reflect the love of God. And that's what great stories do. Well, Jesus has been telling some wonderful stories in a really compressed setting. He's been in this setting with kind of the common people and then the religious leaders of the day, a mix of some lawyers and teachers. And so he's had quite a crowd. And he's been telling a series of stories. And we're about to hit the third of those stories. He told a story about the prodigal son. He told another story that traditionally is called the shrewd money manager. If you were with us a few weeks ago, I just renamed it the clever COO. But it's just this story about, a very interesting story, by the way, very odd story. But Jesus is telling these stories, and so I'm going to get to the last story kind of in this setting and talk about this. This story in particular is one that in some ways, in its interpretation, has hurt the church through the centuries because of our lack of understanding of the story. In other ways, I hope it has actually benefited the church in great ways. But it's a story that a lot of people have written about, so this is going to be a fun story to talk about today. Before we do, I want to talk about three different types of stories. The first type is idealistic. Idealistic are the kinds of stories that make the big money in the box office. They're kind of your pop culture stories. They're stories that express the way we wish the world was. The bad guy always gets his comeuppance. The good guy always wins. And they lived. Yes, you've seen some idealistic stories. Goodness triumphs over evil when we outsmart evil. That's kind of the idea. Then you have the pessimistic stories. These are the ones that win the Sundance Film Festival. And most Academy Awards. These have a vision of life, not how we wish it, but how we believe it really is. Passion will destroy us. Evil consumes us because human nature is evil. And kind of on it goes. It doesn't leave you with hope, but it leaves you with despair. Now, I will say this in defense of especially a lot of independent filmmakers or storytellers. The benefit of the pessimistic stories, at least at times, is that it leaves you with tough questions. Now, sometimes they call it a cold curtain. The movie comes to an end. Have you ever seen one of these? The movie comes to an end and you're like, that's it? Yeah. Seriously? What? That can't be the end. Somebody make an ending. Well, what's happening? And again, in their defense, they're trying to disrupt your norm enough to cause you to ask questions. Now, some are just going, no, this is the way life is. Deal with it. There is no hope. Of course, that is not the story of the Bible. So the third kind of story is called the ironic story. And this is the kind of story that Jesus seems to tell over and over again. It combines both. There is this recognition that there is this evil in the world, but there is also something related to good. There is love. And here's the thing about love. Love is always a blissful agony. If you've ever been in love, you know exactly what I mean. The nature of love is that it hurts. Because if you actually love someone, they're going to do something to let you down. And if you love someone or something, someone's going to scratch the door of that thing. If you love someone, something's going to happen to them that you wish didn't happen, and it's going to hurt. So love, you recognize that life cuts both ways. We gladly suffer, however. We actually all gladly suffer. Some of you are like, I don't gladly suffer. There's no gladly in my suffering. No, we all gladly suffer, for without love, life has no meaning. So we continue to place ourselves in love, because without love, there's no reason for existence. By the way, it's the reason when you don't feel loved, that you start to question your purpose. When you don't feel like you have someone to love, that you start questioning life's meaning. It all comes back to this idea of love. But when you enter into love, you know intuitively pain will exist because both have to exist. But this is ironic. It's non-dual thinking. It's going, both the good and the bad have to both exist. This has to exist for life to exist, at least in this time and space existence that we're currently in. So Jesus tells over and over again these ironic stories. Now, what he's doing in the midst of creating irony is he's also flipping it on its head over and over again. He keeps taking things and flipping them upside down. In order to understand Jesus' teaching, this is an important thing to recognize. Jesus is a prophet. He's coming to agitate and he's coming to disrupt, but he's also a teacher. He's a rabbi. He's coming to teach. So Jesus has a couple of things that he's attempting to do as he's telling stories to the crowd. Now keep in mind, he didn't start teaching till he was 30. So for 30 years, he's just collecting information. He's studying in a traditional way. He's studying the scripture, but even more so, he's spending time with people and he's watching the rhythms of life. He's sitting there at 12 years old with a farmer going, now tell me what happens when you plant that seed. He's learning about life, about relationships, about agriculture, about culture, about urban living, and he uses all of this and weaves them through his stories. 30 years just to teach for 3. And as he's teaching, he's combining all of this, and he has to do 2 things. He, one, has to disrupt the pattern of thinking for the religious leaders who believe that they are going to rule based on fear and control, and he has to disrupt the pattern of thinking for the common man or the poor, the oppressed, who are also thinking we're meant to be oppressed, or who think the only way out of oppression is violence. There were a group of people who were not into being oppressed, but their only alternative in their mind, they were called zealots. One of them was actually a follower of Jesus. Their way was through violence. So Jesus is coming and he's describing a third way, and he has to disrupt. He has to create some confusion. He has to deconstruct, and then he has to reconstruct. Now, here's the problem some of us have gotten into through the years when it comes to Jesus' storytelling. Some of us were trained, I grew up this way, that when you read the Bible, you have to understand everything is literal. So when you read the stories, whatever it says is exactly how it happened. Now, this becomes problematic when you read a verse like, God is our rock. There's a lot of problems, actually, with God is our fortress. God is like the bird that puts his wings around it. You actually can't read the Bible literally. So literalists actually have hurt us because they've taken away all the artistic creation and imagination that's part of the storytelling. Here's the other thing I want to tell you about storytellers. This is really important, especially if a storyteller in your life. Storytellers, well, we take license with facts. Like, there's a lot of liberty when it comes to telling stories. So, for instance, I might tell a story. Somebody might be asking something, and I'll go, well, this week I was having a conversation with somebody, and you're not going to believe this. I was talking to them, and they said their friend told them this. Well, maybe it wasn't this week. Maybe it was like the end of last week, and maybe it wasn't their friend. It was their brother, but I didn't really want to say their brother, so I said friend. But to me, it's all real relevant. Those are details. We're getting down to like what we talked about. Storytellers do this all the time. Now, by the way, if you're like if you tend to be a literalist and you have a personality or Enneagram type that's this, when you listen to a storyteller, you'll even interrupt a storyteller. Someone's telling the story and they go, yeah, on Monday. It wasn't Monday, it was Tuesday. Okay, yeah. Anyway, Tuesday, I was talking to my friend. You weren't talking to him, I was talking to him. Oh yeah, okay. My wife was talking to him. But what she found out was, but storytellers do this all the time. They're compressing details. Now, here's the thing about the Gospels. When you read some of these stories, you go, this is exactly how it was told, right? Just clear this up. There wasn't a recording device. Jesus did not have a lapel mic. And there was no recording device when Jesus was telling the story. So our recordings in the gospel are from years, decades later, where people are going, hey, what was that story Jesus told again? Oh yeah, I remember him talking about. And so they're recording, they're kind of compressing the information, putting it into story and going, this is kind of how the story happened. So that's why, by the way, sometimes if you'll read Matthew, you'll read about a story in Matthew and the same story is told like in Luke. And you're like, oh, he said there was 2 men, and he said there was 1. Well, they're just remembering the story from their different perspective. And that doesn't mean that the Bible's is suddenly fallible or you can't trust the Bible or anything. It's just that they're stories. And the stories have a point. They're meant to create, they're meant to agitate, they're meant to raise your imagination, they're meant to cause you to think about things. Well, unfortunately, what's happened through the years is sometimes Bible stories were read, and they were read in such a literal fashion that we built whole theological presuppositions out of a story. And one of the ways this happened was in the Middle Ages. There was an Italian poet, I've referenced this before, named Dante, and he wrote a book called The Divine Comedy. He wrote really a poem, and there's 3 acts in the poem, and the part called Dante's Inferno is the part that I'm referencing the most. But in The Divine Comedy, this wonderful piece of poetry, but terrible theology, he basically sets up this picture of the afterlife. And he sets up this picture that there's this purgatory, this state of existence, and then there's eternal damnation, and then there's an eternal heavenly existence. Now, the problem in his poetic referencing is he's not really using eternal in a circular form that we existed in the past, present, and future, but he's using it in kind of a perpetual afterlife existence. So like after Earth, linear, so your time and space, Earth, then there's another time and space after life where you burn in a fiery place or you walk on streets of gold. This is Dante's Divine Comedy. Middle Ages. Unfortunately, Christians have built a theology around Dante's Divine Comedy, proof texted it with one story. The story I'm about to tell you. We have, some of us, I grew up and being taught this was exactly what the afterlife was like. I wasn't taught a whole lot about it being eternal. Like nobody really mentioned a whole lot that I existed before the foundations of the earth. Even though that's in Scripture, that didn't come up a lot. A lot of conversations about what will happen when you die. And part of it was because there was a pretty hard sell on praying a certain prayer because it would keep me from eternal damnation and it would give me a really nice mansion, depending on how good I was, and a yellow brick road that went to that mansion if I was good. That whole system is built on reward and punishment, which has been going on all the way since the time of Jesus. Now, by the way, if this is the system, avoid punishment, get reward, how is that going to affect everything about how you live? That system is set up so that those in power can rule through fear for control. Jesus is coming in, and this is what he's attempting to blow up. He's going, just so you know, this is not a transactional God. I have poured out my grace upon you. You are loved, period. While you were yet sinners, you're loved. Yeah, but no, you can't earn it. But I love you. Our motivation, some of us, as a result of our neural pathways from Middle Ages forward, and you'll notice actually some of it we could go even further back, was I need to avoid punishment and I want some good stuff. So I should pray a transactional prayer so that I can get into heaven. I even remember, I have lots of friends who would tell me, I grew up in kind of this system where they like had you walk an aisle, pray a prayer. I prayed the prayer like 25 times, they would tell me, just to make sure I got in. So the whole pressure was not really about experiencing God now. There would be a reference to that, but most of the pressure of pressure cooker of Christianity was what would happen after you died. What that misses is everything about Jesus' teaching about the kingdom, which was here and now, about being present to here and now. So let's go into the story, and we'll talk briefly about what it's not, and then hopefully we'll try and talk about what actually was the story meant to be for. What was the theme? What was the premise? What was going on? I'm going to read it to you from the King James Version, because if you grew up like me, if you didn't grow up in church, this probably is actually a little easier. But if you did grow up in church, then this might have been probably how you first heard it. I heard it like this, but I also was given a reference this before, these wonderful is the wrong term, these little tracts that had pictures of people like burning in hell and stuff, and I'd read them before I'd go to bed, and I couldn't sleep, and so this was kind of how I grew up. Okay, anyway, Luke 16:19 through 31. There was a certain rich man who was clothed in purple and fine linen and fared sumptuously every day. But there was a certain beggar named Lazarus, full of sores, who was laid at his gate, desiring to be fed with the crumbs which fell from the rich man's table. Moreover, the dogs came and licked his sores. So it was that the beggar died and was carried by the angels to Abraham's bosom. The rich man also died and was buried. And being in torments in Hades, Hades is the Greek term. In the Hebrew term, it's Sheol. By the way, that's not the afterlife, whatever the burning lake of fire thing is. This is purgatory. This is an intermediate state. This is what the Pharisees would have believed at the time. The reigning Jewish establishment believed, and a lot of other faith beliefs believe there was this purgatory holding center where you went after you died and you waited there until there was a final judgment. So this was Hades Greek, Sheol in Hebrew, but let's be clear, this is not talking about Dante's Inferno, that stuff. This is holding place, purgatory, that's the reference here. So Jesus is taking what the Pharisees believe about purgatory, about this holding place, about Sheol, and he's using it in the story. And being in torments in Hades, he lifted up his eyes and saw Abraham afar off, and Lazarus in his bosom. Then he cried and said, I assume, since he was afar off, Father Abraham had many sons. That wasn't there. Father Abraham, have mercy on me. That was just for me to find out how many actually grew up in the church. Okay. If right now you have no idea when anyone's laughing, just consider yourself blessed. Okay. I don't mean that. I had a lovely church experience. Okay. Just a lot of deconstructing. Then he cried and said, Father Abraham, have mercy on me and send Lazarus that he may dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am tormented in this flame. But Abraham said, I assume, maybe with a megaphone, Son, remember that in your lifetime you received your good things, and likewise Lazarus evil things. But now he is comforted, and you are tormented. And besides all this, between us and you there is a great gulf fixed, so that those who want to pass from here to you cannot, nor can those from there pass to us. Then the rich man said, I beg you, Father, that you would send him, Lazarus, to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. Abraham said to him, They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them. And he said, No, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. But Abraham said to him, If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. Now, again, I heard this story growing up, and it was basically a proof text on what hell was. Nobody really, for me growing up, talked about that last line. Like, what? You can't miss that last line and be like, oh, there is so much in that last line. Like, that last line is the giveaway to the whole thing in so many ways to me. Like, it's just laden with irony. This, to me, is actually a really beautiful story. But unfortunately, again, if you grew up like me, I was just basically told, hey, in case you're wondering what happens when you die, this is what happens. There's a paradise thing, and there's a gulf, and the good guys go there, the bad guys go there, and you're going to be in flame. And that was just generally a description for hell. I don't believe it is at all. I actually think Jesus is telling a wonderful story, a science fiction story, in which he's using the Pharisees' belief system to flip it on their heads and reveal something. Now, he's also using some cultural context, and he might even be using a personal event. So there's actually a lot happening here. Now, one of the things I was taught, this was actually the main reason I'd be like, well, even when I was young, I remember going, I mean, how do you know this is a real story? It just kind of sounds like a story to me. They were like, because they used a real name. Lazarus? Yep. All the other parables don't use real names, so because they used a real name, it has to be real. Now, I'm just going to tell you that doesn't have a whole lot of logic to me. If I said to you, so Tiger Woods, a rabbi and a pastor, walked into a bar. You'd be like, real story, for sure. Now, maybe that one is. But I mean, like, you would automatically know, based even on my setup, that you know this is meant to be a joke. All right? You wouldn't be like, oh, I remember this happened in Tiger Woods' history. This is part of his biography. No, you'd be like, this is a joke. You're about to tell me a joke. You should use a real name. It's the same kind of thing. Now, what's interesting, I can't spend too long here because this could be really fun, but there are a couple of different, let me start with this. Well, I'll go to the first. Kevin told me I can't talk about this too long, but it's so interesting. We'll come back to Lazarus. Here's the first part. It says that there was a man dressed in purple and fine linen, and he had 5 brothers. It's really hard to miss that this seems to be a reference to Caiaphas, who is the high priest at the time, who has 5 brothers. So it seems that he's referencing a real person. Do you remember last week or the week before I was saying, hey, I want you to imagine a political figure, and I was kind of going on and on about that. Was that last week or the week before? 2 weeks ago? And then you remember I said, and if you can't think of a religious figure or a political figure, think of a sports figure. And do you remember that? And I was going on and on setting up the thing about the political figure. I never said anybody's name, but there's a good chance that his name was ringing through the room. I never said his name, but the things I said around the name were causing you to perhaps think of a name. Jesus is doing this. It's the same storytelling technique. He's going, there was a rich man dressed in fine purple, had 5 sons, and people are like, oh, yeah, Caiaphas. Like, everyone would know who he's implying. This is the high priest, the one who sentenced Jesus to death. Also the same person who, when Lazarus was raised from the dead, called the Sanhedrin, called a special gathering and said, hold on, whatever happens, now we got to stop Jesus. It's time to kill him. One man has to die for the rest. The only other person in the Bible named Lazarus is the one that Jesus raised from the dead. Isn't that last phrase an interesting phrase? Now, I can't say that for sure. There's lots of different theologians who have lots of different perspectives, but it's interesting to postulate that it's quite possible Jesus was referring to Lazarus, who would not have been a beggar in the traditional sense that he was financially destitute. He lived in a house with his 2 sisters, Mary and Martha. He was buried in a tomb, which implies he had money. But there is some implication that he may have been very sick, had a skin disease, had sores, perhaps leprosy. So he would have been like a beggar in that he was in need. There also is the implication that for some reason he may have been at Caiaphas' gate, had need, and been ignored. And that Jesus is actually pulling in a personal story. It's also possible, because there's storytelling, that when the story was recorded later on, someone was like, let's throw Lazarus in here instead of just a generic name, because this could be fun. We don't know exactly how it happened. What I'm trying to help you understand is this is a story, and it's a story told with great creativity to try and force the Pharisees, or at least expose the Pharisees in their thinking, and help those who are oppressed change their paradigm for living. And it's a science fiction story. Let's just go for just a second into the story. The story opens up, you hear this kind of general thing about eating, and that's at a table and all, but then next thing you know, Lazarus is taken by angels, so imagine the imagery, he doesn't, because the contrast is, the rich man goes to the grave first, then he winds up in Hades, in Sheol. Meanwhile, Lazarus, he's just taken by the angels. And he's placed in Abraham's bosom, which means his chest cavity. So we have Lazarus in Abraham's chest cavity, far off, and then you have the rich man in eternal torment, flames burning him up, but apparently he has no problem with cognitive thought and casual conversation. And his only request is for a drop of water for some brief alleviation of pain. And while he's there, he suddenly has this deep compassion for his brothers and asks if somebody might go talk to him. Like, come on, there's no way this thing is literal. It's a science fiction story, and it's a beautiful story. And Jesus is pulling from all these elements, culture, perhaps his personal friend Lazarus. He's attacking the religious structure of the day, and he's attempting to expose, and here's the main thing. Here's what he's going after. Over and over again, remember our other stories, prodigal son, remember the story about the shrewd money manager, the stories that had just come through. You follow this trajectory arc. He's going, Pharisees, you're continuing to oppress other people through fear and control based on external reward, this system of punishment and reward system, so that you can maintain control, so you can oppress them, so that essentially evil will continue to rule. And what you're implying, this is what you keep saying to the people is, if you are rich, you are blessed. If you are poor, you are cursed. If you are rich, you are blessed. If you're poor, you are cursed. This is the ongoing message. By the way, do you know how the Pharisees got rich? They would get into cahoots with the tax collectors, we talked about them, and they would raise taxes on certain landowners to the point that the landowners just couldn't hit the taxes. As soon as they couldn't hit it, in comes the law and goes, well, sorry, we're going to have to foreclose on your land. They foreclose on their land. Then the Pharisees, they come in, they buy it for a steal, and that person who had been middle class, suburban, whatever guy, owned his piece of property, now either goes to live with a family member or is completely destitute and is a beggar on the street. So it's adding insult to injury. This guy who once had his house, lived in his house, was working his land, the whole thing, through corruption, lost everything, had nothing, and the Pharisees are going, well, you're cursed by God because you don't have anything. In the press, it's because you stole everything from me. Can you imagine the animosity? Do you see? And they had no power. And so that's why you had the religious zealots going, we're tired of this. Through violence, let's have an overthrow. It's also why you had people like Judas disappointed because they thought Jesus was going to come in and have a political coup. And Jesus came in with a different message saying, actually, it's love that is going to win the day. We're going to do this through love, not through violence. We're going to do love, not through revolution. And this is essentially what Jesus is going after in this story. It's this brilliant way of twisting everything on its head and going, here you are living in abundance, and you refuse to even give a crumb to the person in need. And instead, not only do you not give them a crumb, but you've hardened your heart, and you've been abusive and oppressive to those in need. Guess what? The person ultimately who has nothing, they're not cursed. They're actually living in the bosom of Father Abraham. They're actually closer to the center of this whole belief system, closer to the heart of God than you are. The truth is, you're actually in your own hell because of your selfishness and because of your oppression and because of that evil. This is the basic thrust of the story. Now, I'll say this. We're all tempted to ignore that and instead go, could I do the punishment and reward system instead? Because that's actually a little easier. And when I'm on the top of that system, I really like it. It works really well as a parent. Skittles go a long way for behavior. And so I don't know that I really want to get rid of that system because love and grace are too ambiguous. You can't control those things. There's actually a temptation for us to want to actually be in a system full of punishment and reward. As a matter of fact, we have neural pathways here because we've been doing it for so many years. The Industrial Revolution is one cultural thing that actually reinforced this. And I want to highlight this because I want to talk about how it affects us. and how it's affected everything. And why, by the way, you could take a passage like this that seems so it's so evident that it's a story, it's not a literal thing, but why Christianity in particular, perhaps for 50, 80 years, whatever, kind of embrace this as what it might be referring to in the afterlife. Here's why. I want you to think about post-industrial revolution. What happens? Suddenly you have the common worker who makes a common wage, and you have massive industrialists who make a great deal of money on the backs of the common worker who makes a common wage. What's the message said? There's obviously a great disparity in wealth there, right? By the way, similar with Pharisees in their day. But what's the message said to the common man? Hey, get a job, do what you're told, don't deviate or color outside the lines. If you do what the manual says, you will be rewarded. Follow the rules. If you don't do as the manual says, you will be punished. Do what it says, there'll be a pension plan, perhaps a bonus, and a Timex watch at the end. I grew up in a blue-collar town. This is the message. Just do what you're told. Don't let the artistic person in you come alive. Don't innovate. Don't be entrepreneurial. Don't dream dreams. Do what you're told. We'll manage life for you. Who will manage life? Well, whoever determines the rules. Well, who determines the rules? Well, whoever has the wealth or is the interpreter of the holy book. So here's the thing about artists, prophets, and those who've been oppressed. They don't care a whole lot about rules. And they're always asking annoying, agitating questions. And they provoke change. Why? Because they have little to lose. Those who have great wealth are the ones who typically are in the most fear, because they have to protect something. Now, by the way, this doesn't mean if you have wealth, you're a bad person or any of those things. I'm talking about those who wield their wealth with a sense of scarcity instead of abundance. Those who have much, but don't give much. The disparity between what they have and what they give is so far off. That's part of the message here. By the way, if you live in America, which I assume is most of you, unless we have some guests today, you live in a land of abundance. Just in case you're not, you go, I'm a college student, I'm broke, I don't have whatever. Compared to the rest of the world and other times in history, at some level, you have abundance. What do you do with the abundance that you have? This is part of where Jesus was going with this. See, the nature of the kingdom is that it's full of generosity. It's not holding something over people's heads out of fear, but it's actually giving out of generosity. By the way, we're talking about the idea of what happens in the idea of work in the Industrial Revolution, but the truth is we could say the same thing about education. We have a public education system that actually feeds this way of thinking. Standardized testing for standardized children, for standardized jobs, for standardized religion. The message to our children is, follow the rules. Everybody does it this way. And the message of religion for years was, follow the rules, everybody does it this way. If you do, you go to heaven. If you don't, you go to a lake of fire and wish someone would give you a drop of water for your tongue. What I'm trying to do is point out that this is everywhere. The system didn't just exist in the New Testament, it didn't just exist in the Middle Ages, it exists today, it will probably exist tomorrow. Why? Because we often sell our souls for a bowl of pottage. We're basically going, I want to give up this freedom and let someone else oppress me and do what I'm supposed to do. That's the lie. We're actually meant to create. We're meant to go find who our true identity is in Christ. So here's the message. When we fail to give to others in need, we place ourselves in hell. The rich man is condemned for what? For doing nothing. That was the issue. He did nothing to help the poor man on his own doorstep. When we harden our hearts, theme number 2 in this story, we place ourselves in torment. And Jesus is saying, here's the thing, not even someone else's resurrection will get your attention. Not only is this a reference perhaps to the resurrection of Lazarus, but it has to be a reference to his own. He's saying, there is an entire group of people, I will be hanging on a cross. I'll come back to life, and they will still not get it. Why? Because their hearts are hardened. Why? Because it's more important for them to do right, or it's more important for them to be right than to do good. I have a friend of mine who says this all the time. He's a therapist. He says, hey, would you rather be right or would you rather be happy? And here's what he's essentially saying. And look, I know people like this. I got some relationships that are like this, and I want to be a southerner and say, bless their heart. But the deal is, it's so important for them to be right, I watch the relationships around them disintegrate. And I got one person in my mind in particular, I know him well enough to know he's actually living in his own personal hell. But bless God, he's going to be right. And he's going to be right all the way to the grave on this trajectory. What's happening? He lives in hell. He lives in torment. I see it all over his face. He's tormented, but he refuses to walk in humility. He refuses to take responsibility, and he refuses to live with an abundance of grace. Instead, he has to point out the flaws of others because it's the only way he knows how to deal with his own shame. This is the overall message that's being presented, I think, that's coming from this passage, is to recognize that we are meant to live lives of generosity. Generosity with our financial resources, generosity with our time, but generosity with our love. Why do we not live generously with our love? We're all the way back to the beginning. Because love hurts. So most of us are measuring, how much do I really want to give? Some of you love so big, like you open the faucet, but you got hurt so many times, you close that faucet off, you just let it drip and just fling a few drops every now and then. I can do that. But I'm going to love like this, because I don't like pain. I don't like being hurt. And so as a result, you just bear your own sort of hell and torment, because it's the only way you know how to measure the pain of loss. Can I just tell you something? Willpower is not the answer. If you go, well, Jamie, how do I fix that? I got to just love a little harder and let my walls down. It's not about willpower. It's about surrender. Love is something we surrender to. And I'm not talking about surrendering to the other person. I'm talking about surrendering to love. Love is what happens in between you and the other person. It's a symphony that arises when you interact. But see, the problem with most of us is we've misunderstood love and attachment. Attachment means you exist to please me. You are my little God, and you need to perform accordingly. And when you don't, I get hurt. I go, you don't love me. That's not love. That's you worshiping another person and asking them to be your God. That's called attachment. Idolatry, addiction, we got lots of words for it. Love is when you go, there's another person, what rises between us? Here's my generosity, here's their generosity. Here's my surrender, here's their surrender. Here's my expression, here's my giving, here's my receiving. It's this exchange that's described in Scripture was what healthy relationships look like. And it's a symphony that rises and a symphony that falls between us. It can't be managed. Why? Because God is love. If you're experiencing love with another person, you're experiencing God. Peter Rollins says this: instead of religious discourse being a type of drink designed to satisfy our thirst for answers, Jesus made his teaching salty, evoking thirst. Instead of offering a scientific explanation that would convince, or instead of putting his miracles on Instagram, he says, publicizing the miracles so as to compel his listeners, no, instead Jesus engaged in a poetic discourse that spoke to the heart of those who would listen. In a world where people believe they are not hungry, we must not offer food, but rather an aroma that helps them desire the food that, by the way, we cannot provide. We are a people born from a response to hints of the divine. But not only this, we must embrace the idea that we are also called to be hints of the divine to others. Would you bow your heads and close your eyes with me? Place of reflection. There's a temptation for all of us to pull it in tight, pull it in close, and live from scarcity. The temptation is there. There's a temptation to just give ourselves over to the rules of reward and punishment. Live in fear. Live a transactional experience with God and with love. The thing is, it always leads to a hellish experience. It always leads to a tormented soul. If you're here this morning and you feel anxiety and loneliness and disconnection from others, you're tormented. You feel the flame. Ask yourself why. Are you generous with your life, with your love? Or do you hold on to it? Do you misunderstand what love really is? Are you having to learn the difference between attachment, making someone an addiction rather than letting someone just be an expression of the divine? You were created in love, by love, for love. Pulled in close, wrapped in tight to Abraham's bosom. It's the picture of being cared for and known, literally carried in the heart of the Father. When you rest in that kind of love, you can't help but give it away. You and I are hints of the divine. If we'll open ourselves long enough to be seen and to be known. Father, I know too many stories. I know for many of us, we were abused. We were wounded. We were hurt. And God, there's this primal thing within us that just closes us off because we don't want to feel the pain. But God, we recognize that we cannot selectively numb. We've numbed the pain, but we've also numbed the beauty. And Father, I pray that you'd give us the strength, that we would recognize, give us courage to press forward, that we would see that we have to open ourselves for connection. And that when the pain comes, we recognize that other people are broken and they cannot touch our identity, which is in you. Your love remains. It's not going anywhere and it's not transactional. Your grace abounds every moment of every day, within the context of time and in the Alpha and Omega of eternity. God, let us fall into that truth so that we don't listen to the lies that we are unlovable or unworthy of being loved, or that someone can take our love from us. So Father, thank you for the expression of art and music, community. Would you hear from your children now as we sing back about your love for us? In Jesus' name, amen.